The sky over Arizona always looked endless, but nothing about this day felt free. Heat poured down in heavy sheets, turning the blacktop into a shimmering river of mirages and regret. Walter Brooks stood in the unyielding sun on a deserted stretch of Highway 86, blinking away sweat as a blue Ford Explorer grew small in the distance. The air burned against his skin, but the real sting was deeper. A sharp, invisible pain that started in his chest and curled up behind his ribs. His son had just left him here. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a bottle of water tossed onto the dusty shoulder, and a voice that didn't belong to the boy he'd raised. "I can't keep carrying dead weight, Dad. Good luck." There's a kind of silence that feels alive, that crawls under your skin and settles there, daring you to scream. Walter didn't scream. He listened to the hum of the wind and the distant hum of a semi-truck somewhere miles away, invisible behind a ridge. He waited for the pounding in his head to slow, but it didn't. It almost never did anymore. He stared after the retreating taillights until there was nothing left but the echo of rubber on asphalt. Walter had always thought that if his life ended badly, he'd see it coming. Some big storm, some inevitable slide into darkness. But this was small, personal. A single sentence, a single door slammed, and the only family he had in the world was gone. For a moment, he wondered if this was what Martha, his late wife, had meant when she warned him years ago. People show their real face when no one's looking. Walter was 68 and he'd survived loss before. He'd held Martha's hand as she slipped away in a cold Phoenix hospital room, watched Scott's baby face harden into the angular mask of a man who smiled less and lied more. He'd lost his job to downsizing, watched savings dwindle, watched his own hands grow more knotted and useless each year. But none of that had prepared him for this. For the humiliation, the shock, the sense of being discarded like an old couch. He let the water bottle roll to his feet and didn't touch it yet. He scanned the scrubland, the whirling dust devils and cacti standing sentinel, and remembered when Scott was small. How the boy had once clung to his jeans in parking lots, how he used to beg for one more bedtime story, how Walter would have crossed any distance to keep his son safe. The memory burned worse than the sun. Maybe that's what made him take the first step. Not hope, not rage, not even a plan. Just the ache of knowing no one was coming to save him. His mind flipped between sharp flashes of the past and the brutal clarity of now. He saw the first time Scott had stormed out as a teenager, hurling "You don't get it, Dad," at the living room wall. He remembered coming home from double shifts at the mechanic's shop, always bringing a candy bar for Scott, always carrying home greasy jeans and exhaustion. He remembered the summer he sold his own father's watch just to help Scott cover his tuition. That watch, silver, heavy, ticked loud enough to drown out a man's regrets. Gone now like so much else. Sweat trickled down the creases of Walter's face as he started to walk. Each step pressed him deeper into the moment, forcing him to admit there was no rescue. There would be no headlines, no Amber Alert, no family search party. Just an old man walking east, trying to remember the last thing he'd said to his son that sounded anything like love. He couldn't remember. He could remember, though, the sound of Scott's voice this morning, tight and businesslike, barely hiding annoyance as he rushed Walter into the car. "Got places to be, Dad. Let's not make this complicated." Walter's legs ached, but he kept moving, scanning the ditches for snakes, looking for any break in the horizon. There was nothing but the relentless hum of heat and the distant shimmer of distant pavement. The isolation was total, so absolute that he wondered if Scott had picked this spot for that reason. A place so empty the world might never notice if he just disappeared. He thought about Martha again. He thought about her hands, about her voice as it faded to a whisper. "Don't let Scott turn your heart hard, Walt, no matter what happens." But that was before the world shrank down to just one old man and a highway and the memory of a promise no one intended to keep. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, praying for a bar of service. Nothing. Just the black mirror of a screen reflecting back a face he barely recognized, rimmed with dust and disbelief. For a split second he almost laughed. A brittle, choking sound. It would be so easy to lie down in the gravel, to let the heat do what time had started. But even as his knees wobbled, something stubborn rooted him in place. He would not be a victim, not today. Not ever, if he could help it. He reached for the water bottle, took a small sip, forced himself to ration. Somewhere to the north, a brown sign poked above the sagebrush, a mileage marker for some gas station he'd never heard of. 8 miles, the numbers said. He'd walked further before, hadn't he? He remembered the time he'd gone door to door looking for a lost dog when Scott was 7. Remembered the way hope and fear mixed in your mouth, dry as chalk. This would be no different. Just another long road. Just another job to finish. With every step, he could feel the weight of years settle on his shoulders, but he refused to let it pin him down. He let his mind wander, pulling memories like bandages from old wounds. The night Scott came home drunk, begging for a loan. The day Walter forgave him. The slow, steady erosion of trust. In a way, this moment had been coming for years. Maybe he'd ignored the warning signs. Martha's worried glances, Scott's slippery words, the slow draining of his savings. Maybe he'd chosen to believe, right up to the end, that blood was enough to guarantee love. Now, he had nothing but time to consider the cost of that mistake. Each mile brought a new ache, a fresh regret, and yet, underneath it all, a strange, building resolve. Scott had made a choice. So would Walter. He replayed the scene in his mind, searching for some hint, some clue he'd missed, but all he found was the cold certainty that things would never go back to the way they were. Scott, meanwhile, was already home. The house in Tucson was too big, too quiet. He stalked through the rooms with anxious energy, rifling through drawers, checking the safe for the inheritance documents. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed, a dull, steady note that felt like mockery. On the front was a note, pressed beneath a plastic magnet. A note Walter had written days ago, before any of this, before he'd even guessed how deep the betrayal would run. Scott read the note twice, then 3 times, his fingers trembling, his mind racing with questions. In the shimmering heat, Walter kept walking. Every breath tasted like dust and longing. He pictured Scott's face as a boy, the way he'd once looked up at Walter with absolute trust. He wondered where that boy had gone, what dark corridor of growing up had swallowed him whole. He wondered, too, how a father was supposed to keep loving a child who saw him as nothing but a burden. The gas station was still far off, but closer than it had been an hour ago. Walter felt his feet blistering, his throat raw, but he pressed on. He imagined what Scott was doing. Counting money, pacing the kitchen, erasing voicemails before anyone could hear. He imagined a life where this story ended in disaster, but he refused to let that be his story. He was no one's cautionary tale. He looked up at the sky, endless and blinding. He let the heat bake away the shock, leaving only something hard and bright at the center of his chest. This was not the end. Not yet. He would walk, and then he would find a phone, and then, God help Scott, he would write the next chapter himself. As dusk began to gather at the edges of the desert, Walter's mind turned over all the possible endings. Rescue, surrender, revenge. But something deeper, colder had taken root. He would not fade into the background of his own life. He would not be erased, not by his own son, not by the unfeeling math of inheritance and resentment. Somewhere behind him, the world went on. The news on in someone's living room, a dog barking, a neighbor glancing up at the first stars. Somewhere ahead, the road curved toward possibility. Walter kept walking, one step at a time, carrying with him not just anger, but the quiet promise of justice. This was only the beginning, and deep down he knew nothing about what was coming next would be simple or easy or safe. This was a new kind of story, and Walter Brooks was determined to finish it on his own terms. Each step on that burning Arizona asphalt was a journey deeper into memory, but not the gentle kind that brings comfort or nostalgia. Instead, the heat seemed to melt the years between past and present, so that every ache in Walter Brooks' legs was matched by a raw ache in his heart. His mind, stubborn as ever, insisted on replaying scenes he both cherished and wished he could erase. The mind was cruel that way. It didn't wait for quiet or safety or rest. Sometimes the loneliest walk is the one taken with your own thoughts. Walter didn't remember feeling this alone even after Martha died. Back then, he was surrounded by neighbors dropping off casseroles, friends from the old repair shop calling to check in, even Scott's awkward attempts to comfort him, which mostly involved long silences and looking everywhere but his father's eyes. But now, with nothing but sun and distance for company, the reality of his own solitude became impossible to ignore. He let the weight of it rest heavy on his shoulders, knowing that if he dropped it, there would be nothing left to carry at all. He thought of home, the little house on Catalina Drive in the Tucson suburbs, shaded by two old mesquites, the one Martha had chosen because it reminded her of summers growing up in New Mexico. In his mind, he could see her tending to the flower beds that struggled against the desert soil, her hat flopping over her eyes, her laugh bright and sudden when Scott was small and fearless. Walter tried to hold on to those memories, but even the good ones seemed touched now by sadness, as if each petal she'd planted was tinged with warning. He could almost hear her voice in the wind. "Don't let them use you up, Walt." Martha was the anchor of his life, the person who smoothed his sharp edges and believed in the good in everyone, even when Walter was too tired or too proud to see it. When she passed, a soft kind of chaos took over the house. Scott moved back in, at first out of grief or maybe out of guilt. Walter hadn't minded. The house felt less empty. But over time, Scott's presence became less about connection and more about convenience. A handout for gas money, a request for help with car payments, the unspoken understanding that Dad would always be there to pick up the pieces. Walter knew he'd let it happen. Maybe he was too soft, or maybe he still believed, deep down, that the best way to love was to give without question. It wasn't that he resented helping Scott. Every father he knew had done the same, at least in the beginning. But somewhere along the way, the scales had tipped. What started as kindness became expectation. Walter became an accessory to Scott's life, the safety net that was never supposed to break. As he trudged along, the soles of his shoes already feeling the sting of heat through thin rubber, Walter replayed all the times he'd given in. He'd cashed out part of his modest retirement to cover Scott's college tuition at Arizona State. He'd taken on extra shifts at the auto shop when Scott's first business went belly up, barely asking questions before signing a check. Even after he'd been laid off, when bills started piling up and the insurance payout after Martha's passing barely kept them afloat, Scott always seemed to need a little more. And Walter always gave it because that's what fathers do. Or so he thought. That wasn't the whole truth, of course. There were moments, rare but real, when Scott had shown gratitude. Walter held those close now, like talismans against the betrayal. The first time Scott fixed something on his own, the two of them crouched under a rusty truck bed, laughing when the wrench slipped and oil spattered across Scott's face. Or the night before Martha's funeral, when Scott broke down and sobbed in Walter's arms, a grown man turned child again. Those moments made it harder to understand what had changed, or when the pain in Walter's feet sharpened, snapping him back to the present. His water was already half gone, and the sun still hadn't begun to sink. He checked his phone again, no service, but the GPS still glowed. That little blue arrow was his only tether to the world now. The map said there was a gas station 8 miles ahead, a place called Coyote Corner. Walter repeated the name like a prayer, trying to convince himself it was real, that he could reach it before sunset. With every step, he promised Martha, and maybe himself, that he would make it, that he would not be left to vanish, not in the way Scott had planned. Meanwhile, back on Catalina Drive, Scott was pacing the kitchen, his nerves stretched tight. He'd left the front door unlocked, as if expecting Walter to stroll back in any minute. But the house was empty. It felt colder, somehow, despite the thick Tucson heat outside. Every creak of the floor, every hum of the fridge, made Scott jump. He'd already scoured Walter's old room, looking for any sign of a will or a note or something that would explain away the gnawing feeling in his gut. All he'd found was a faded photograph tucked into a book. Scott at 10, beaming at the Grand Canyon, Walter's arm draped across his shoulders, both of them covered in sunburn and dust. Scott shoved the picture deep into a drawer, unable or unwilling to look at his own face. On the fridge, Walter's note was still there, beneath a magnet shaped like a Route 66 sign. It wasn't long, but the words landed like stones. If I don't return, the truth comes out. Some things can't be buried, Scott. Not forever. The handwriting was careful, unhurried. Scott read it again and again, feeling the prickling rise of panic in his chest. Was it just an old man's cryptic threat? Or was it something more? Walter, for his part, could feel his body growing weaker as he walked, but his mind only sharpened. He thought about the old repair shop where he'd worked for 30 years, about the men who came and went, some staying just long enough to learn a trade, others burning out, disappearing without warning. He remembered the day he taught Scott to drive, the way his son's hands shook on the wheel, the way Walter's patience held them both steady. He remembered when trust was simple, untested. Now it felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. He passed a rusted sign, half the letters missing, but the distance was still legible. 5 miles to Coyote Corner. Walter allowed himself a slow, measured drink, counting out the sips. His shirt clung to his back, every breath tasting of iron and old sweat. He remembered Martha's last words in the hospital. Don't let Scott mistake your kindness for weakness. At the time, he'd smiled, said he understood. Now, he wondered if he ever really had. He found himself thinking not just of Scott, but of all the little betrayals that add up over a lifetime. The friend who borrowed money and never paid it back. The supervisor who promised a raise that never came. The neighbors who drifted away after Martha died. Was it really any wonder that trust was so fragile? That it could be shattered by something as simple as a silent drive through the desert, a door closing, a car speeding away? In the distance, a shape flickered on the horizon. Could be a sign, could be a trick of the heat. Walter pressed on, ignoring the growing ache in his calves, the dizziness starting at the edges of his vision. The landscape blurred, but his mind stayed sharp, sifting through every conversation with Scott over the last year. He remembered the time Scott asked him to co-sign a loan, the way he'd hesitated, then relented. He remembered the look in Scott's eyes, a mix of relief and entitlement, as if Walter owed him that and more. Walter realized now that it wasn't about money, or even about the house. It was about being needed and what happened when that need became a weapon. He could almost hear Scott's voice, echoing with an edge he'd never noticed before. You always said family takes care of each other. Well, maybe now it's your turn. It hurt, but it also clarified something inside Walter. Maybe it was finally time to stop letting himself be used up. By the time he could read the gas station sign, every muscle in his body was screaming. He barely noticed the battered pickup truck that pulled off the road behind him, gravel crunching under its tires. The driver was a stranger, but his eyes were kind, the lines around his mouth deep with sun and laughter. The man offered him a ride without asking questions. Walter hesitated, pride and suspicion warring inside him, but in the end he climbed in. He was tired, and tired men sometimes had to trust. As they drove, the stranger talked about nothing and everything: old baseball games, the rising cost of groceries, the unpredictability of the world these days. Walter listened, half here, half lost in thought. When the man dropped him at Coyote Corner, Walter thanked him, realizing he didn't even know his name. The world kept turning. People came and went. Only the lessons remained. Inside the gas station, Walter found shade, water, and a moment of safety. He asked to use the phone, voice steady, refusing to betray the fear that still stalked him. He called an old friend from the repair shop, a man who'd once told Walter, "If you ever need help, just ask." Walter didn't say much. He didn't have to. The friend understood, promised to come. As he waited, Walter sat at a dusty table near the window, watching the sky bleed from blue to orange. He wondered how Scott was feeling right now, whether his son's guilt would ever outweigh his greed. He wondered if forgiveness was still possible, or even desirable. He wondered if Martha would be proud of how he was handling himself, or if she would be heartbroken at what their family had become. In that hour between daylight and darkness, Walter made a quiet promise to himself. No matter what came next, he would not be silent. He would not be erased, not by time, not by betrayal, not by the cowardice of a son who mistook love for weakness. He would take back the narrative of his life, piece by piece, even if he had to build it from the ashes. Somewhere, a truck engine rumbled to life, headlights flickering in the growing dusk. Walter stood up, steadied himself, and prepared to keep moving. The road ahead was uncertain, the cost of survival higher than he'd ever imagined. But with every breath, every step, he became less a victim and more a man who refused to be forgotten. Walter waited in the sticky air of Coyote Corner, a cup of weak coffee cooling between his hands, the harsh hum of a refrigerator the only constant sound. The world outside the grimy window was bathed in orange and gold, but Walter's thoughts spun in the strange hush that follows a storm, quiet on the surface, but charged underneath. Every muscle in his body ached from the day's ordeal, but his mind, sharpened by exhaustion, raced from memory to memory, piecing together the subtle betrayals that had led him here. He knew this wasn't an accident. He could see the lines now, traced in sharp relief by the pain of Scott's abandonment. The clues had always been there, he realized, if only he'd had the heart to look. He replayed every recent conversation with his son, examining them in the harsh light of hindsight. The change had happened slowly, almost gently, at first small requests for help, little lies about money. Scott's voice had grown more practiced, his expressions harder to read. Walter remembered the first time Scott asked him to sign some papers, brushing off Walter's questions with a tired smile, promising, "It's just for insurance, Dad." He remembered the way Scott's eyes had flickered away, the guilt hidden behind practiced charm. Even then, Walter's gut had warned him, but he'd ignored it. That was what fathers did for their children. He'd convinced himself it was loyalty, not fear. Now, sitting in a gas station 3 towns from home, Walter let himself see the truth. Scott had begun to treat him like an obstacle, not a father. The slow draining of their savings, the way Scott's wife Lila looked through him at the dinner table, the cold calculation behind Scott's reassurances. All of it clicked together now, forming a picture of something darker than neglect. The real betrayal, Walter realized, wasn't in the leaving. It was in the years of small wounds, each one slicing a little deeper. His phone, plugged into an outlet beneath the register, finally hummed to life. He saw Scott's name on the call log, dozens of missed calls, a digital river of panic and excuses. Walter scrolled through them, his thumb trembling, not from weakness, but from a new, unfamiliar anger. He opened his voice memos and played back the recording he'd made in the house, the last conversation he'd overheard. Scott and Lila, voices low, plotting in the kitchen late at night. "He's too stubborn to move out on his own," Lila had whispered. "If he's gone, we can list the house. The realtor's ready." Scott's reply was quieter, but the words were unmistakable. "Dad's always said he wants to go his own way. Maybe it's time we help him along." Walter replayed the words until they felt like scars. There was no more room for hope, no more pretending this was about misunderstandings or old age. It was about survival now, about reclaiming what dignity he could from the ashes of his trust. As the minutes ticked by, Walter's plan began to form, stubborn and deliberate. He dug through his wallet for the number of Jim Harlan, an old friend from the Phoenix days, a man whose loyalty had never wavered, who knew about debts and desperation and the quiet ways a life could unravel. He punched in the number and waited, feeling every heartbeat in his throat. When Jim answered, Walter didn't explain everything. He didn't need to. "I need a hand, Jim," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I need to disappear for a while. Can you come get me?" Jim's answer was immediate, a comfort Walter hadn't realized he'd missed. "Give me an hour, Walt. I'll bring the truck." While he waited, Walter let his mind wander over the years, searching for the moment when trust had become a liability. He remembered Scott's graduation, the way he'd gripped Walter's hand with gratitude and relief. He remembered the years after Martha died, the first Christmas without her, when Scott promised to be there always, swearing nothing could break the family apart. Walter believed him. He'd wanted so badly to believe that promise was real, that love could hold against the tide of grief and time. The door to the gas station swung open, and Walter's attention snapped back to the present. Jim walked in, taller and broader than Walter remembered. His face carved with new lines, but the same spark of kindness in his eyes. He gripped Walter's shoulder in greeting, not asking questions, just leading him out into the warm dark of the parking lot. Walter climbed into the cab, feeling an odd sense of relief mixed with shame. He'd never had to ask for rescue before. He told himself this wasn't defeat. It was a change in tactics. As they drove through the night, headlights cutting twin paths through the black, Walter let himself rest. He stared at the road ahead, the old country songs on the radio blurring with Jim's gentle reassurances. He didn't talk much, only when Jim asked a direct question. Even then, he kept the details vague. Walter didn't want pity. What he wanted, what he needed, was time. Time to plan, to rebuild, to make sure Scott never saw him as weak again. Meanwhile, back in Tucson, Scott's panic was growing. He tore through drawers, searching for any sign that Walter had left a note for someone else. He tried calling the police, but stopped short when he realized how it would sound. "My father's missing. He left a note. He might have overheard something." The truth felt too dangerous to speak aloud, so he didn't. He called Lila instead, her voice tense and flat. "It's fine," she said. "He'll come back when he's hungry." But even she sounded uncertain. Scott sat on the edge of Walter's bed, surrounded by the artifacts of a lifetime. Old mechanic's overalls, family photos, Martha's favorite blanket. He couldn't bring himself to look at them too long. The days blurred together. Walter moved in with Jim for a time, working odd jobs, saving every dollar, keeping a low profile. He let his beard grow, changed his routine, stayed off the main roads. Every night, he listened to the recordings of Scott and Lila's plot, the voices that once meant home now echoing with greed and exhaustion. He made backup copies, hid them in places only he knew. He wrote letters to a lawyer, a will he could trust, instructions for what should happen if anything happened to him. Walter became careful, methodical. It was a new skill born of necessity. He started reaching out to other people quietly, cautiously. The woman who worked the desk at the local senior center, who recognized him from years back and promised not to say a word. The neighbor who ran the mail route and agreed to drop off letters without asking questions. Slowly, Walter built a network of trust, not because he needed it, but because he refused to let himself become isolated again. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Walter sat with Jim on the porch, the air thick with the scent of rain on dust. Jim asked the question Walter had been avoiding, "Are you ever going back?" Walter stared at the horizon, thinking of the house on Catalina Drive, the garden that needed tending, the memories that refused to die. "I have to," he finally said, voice rough with determination. "I can't let Scott win. Not after everything." Jim nodded, understanding in his silence. Walter knew it would be dangerous. He knew Scott might be watching, waiting, but there was something in Walter that refused to be erased. He was not a ghost, not a burden to be hidden or forgotten. He was a man who had given everything for family, and he would not let that sacrifice be the end of his story. The night before Walter planned to return, he wrote a final letter to Scott. He didn't threaten, didn't beg. He simply told the truth. "You made your choice," he wrote, "and now I'm making mine. I don't know if forgiveness is possible. Maybe it never was. But I promise you this. You will remember me. You will remember what it means to be a Brooks." He sealed the letter, tucked it into his bag, and watched the desert stars until morning. In the stillness, Walter found a kind of peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of clarity. The next day, as he boarded a bus for Tucson, Walter allowed himself a small, hard smile. He wasn't the same man who had stood abandoned on a highway, lost and afraid. He was something new, something stronger. He arrived in Tucson at dawn, the city washed clean by overnight rain. The streets were empty, the world still holding its breath. Walter walked the familiar blocks back to Catalina Drive, his bag heavy with letters and recordings and the weight of everything left unsaid. He didn't know what he would find. He only knew that this time he would not look away. Returning to Tucson didn't feel like coming home. For Walter Brooks, stepping off the bus that early morning was less a homecoming and more like entering a battlefield. The kind that demanded you know the terrain, your enemies, and your own limits. As he walked Catalina Drive with the sun barely peeking above the rooftops, he felt an odd calm, not the numb kind that had settled over him in the desert, but something harder, edged with intention. He knew he was walking straight back into the den of the very people who had counted him out, written him off, discarded him as easily as they might clear old furniture from the garage. But Walter was not the same man Scott had abandoned. He'd let go of any hope for apologies or explanations. He was there to reclaim his story, even if it meant burning bridges he'd spent a lifetime building. His first stop was not the house but the lawyer's office. He'd arranged the meeting in secret from Jim's place, his voice steady over the line even as his hands had trembled slightly. The receptionist barely glanced at him as he walked in, but Walter didn't care about first impressions. He met with a woman named Rachel Goldberg, a probate specialist whose eyes were sharp and whose handshake reminded him of Martha's, firm and real. He slid the folder of letters and recordings across the desk, the weight of the evidence heavier than anything in his bag. Rachel read, listened, and then sat back, studying Walter not with pity, but with the kind of respect that recognized a survivor. He didn't need her to believe him. The proof was in every word Scott and Lila had spoken in those late-night conspiracies. The plan Rachel helped him build was simple and devastating. Walter would transfer the house and what little remained of his assets into a trust for his granddaughter Emily, bypassing Scott completely. Rachel would file all the necessary paperwork, shielding the trust from any sudden attempts by Scott to claim the property. There would be a police report, but Walter decided, at least for now, not to press criminal charges. Not yet. He wanted to give Scott the chance to understand the full consequences of his actions, to feel the slow panic of losing everything he thought he'd already won. When Walter finally turned onto his street, the familiar shapes of mesquite and cactus felt foreign, the house itself strangely small. He saw Scott's car in the driveway, the hood still hot, as if Scott was too restless to stay anywhere for long. Walter paused at the gate, letting his breath settle. He knew Scott would be watching the window, waiting for the shadow of his father, maybe hoping, maybe dreading. Walter didn't care. He pushed open the gate, stepped inside, and felt the shift in the air, a disturbance that ran deeper than any argument or silent treatment. Inside, the house looked the same, but the energy was off, tense and uncertain. Walter moved quietly, the creak of the floorboards both comforting and accusatory. He saw Scott first, standing in the kitchen, coffee half drunk and hands braced on the counter, looking older than Walter remembered. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Words would come later or not at all. What mattered was that Scott saw him, saw that he'd survived, that he was not the victim Scott had wanted him to be. Walter ignored Scott's sputtering attempts at small talk. He went straight to his old room, checked the drawers, the closet, the shoebox under the bed. Everything just as he'd left it, except for the will, which had been clumsily searched for and left open. He placed his own letter on the pillow, a silent warning. Then he left the house again, locking the door behind him, his mind already moving to the next step. He spent the day gathering evidence. At the auto repair shop where he'd worked for years, he found security footage from the day he'd been driven away by Scott, a silent record of the beginning of it all. He called in a favor from a friend at the DMV to track Scott's car on the highway, timing the trip and matching it with his own records. He spoke quietly with neighbors, asking about anything they'd seen or heard. Most offered nothing, some offered too much. Gossip about Scott and Lila's fights, whispers of money troubles, of realtors visiting when Walter was out of sight. Every detail became part of a mosaic of betrayal, painted in the dull colors of greed and cowardice. Walter met with Rachel again that afternoon, the folder of evidence now thicker, the picture clearer. Rachel moved fast, filing the documents to block any sale of the house, contacting the police to establish a record of elder abuse, should Walter wish to pursue it. She listened as Walter laid out his plans for Emily's future. The trust, the education fund, the promise that Scott would not be able to touch a cent unless he could prove, legally and beyond doubt, that he'd earned it. Walter slept that night at Jim's. The air mattress lumpy, but the house filled with the comfort of old friendship. He lay awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, thinking of Martha, of her laughter echoing through the garden, of her warning not to let Scott take his kindness for weakness. For the first time in years, Walter believed he had done right by her memory. Not with anger, but with action. The days that followed unfolded like a game of chess, each move careful and measured. Walter didn't return home right away. He let Scott stew, let the rumors swirl, let the questions pile up. He contacted Emily's school, ensuring her tuition was covered for the next 2 years, sent a discreet donation to the women's shelter where Martha had volunteered, and left instructions with Rachel to notify him the moment Scott tried to access the trust or sell the house. Every act was a reclamation, a quiet assertion that he would not be erased. Meanwhile, Scott grew frantic. He called Walter's phone endlessly, left messages that shifted from concern to anger to pleading. He contacted lawyers, tried to push through paperwork, but ran into walls at every turn. He fought with Lila, the pressure splintering the careful lies they'd built together. Even the neighbors started asking questions, their curiosity laced with suspicion. Walter watched from a distance, never letting himself get too comfortable. He knew Scott's pride wouldn't let him give up so easily. He knew there was still a chance for confrontation, for things to get ugly. But he was ready now. He had Rachel. He had the truth. He had a plan that didn't depend on anyone else's mercy. One morning, a week after his return, Walter received a letter from Emily, scrawled in blue pen and decorated with hearts. She missed him, she wrote, and hoped he was okay. She wanted to know when he'd come back, if they could make pancakes together like before. Walter read the letter over and over, his resolve hardening. He would not let Scott's failures shape Emily's life. He would show her, even if it took everything he had left, what it meant to stand up for yourself and for what's right. Walter made one final stop before facing Scott again. He visited Martha's grave, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. He stood in the quiet morning, the sun warm on his back, and promised her that he was done being afraid, that he was done letting anyone, even their own son, mistake love for weakness. He promised her that Emily would grow up safe, that the house would not be lost, that their story would not end in silence and shame. When he returned to Catalina Drive for the last time, he brought Rachel with him, her presence a silent shield. Scott was waiting, anger simmering beneath a mask of forced calm. But this time, Walter didn't flinch. He laid out the facts, the evidence, the new will, the trust, the recordings. He let Scott see the full scope of what he'd lost. Not just a house, not just money, but a father's trust, a family's legacy, and any hope of easy redemption. Scott begged, threatened, wept, but Walter did not bend. He let Rachel speak when the law was needed. He let the silence speak when nothing else would do. In that moment, Walter saw not the son he'd raised, but a man undone by his own choices. And for the first time, he felt not sadness, but a fierce, unyielding sense of freedom. The confrontation left the house heavy with unsaid words, but Walter walked away lighter, knowing he had finally chosen himself, chosen what was right. The past could not be changed, but the future, at last, belonged to him. Walter Brooks awoke before dawn, the old restlessness returning after years of living half asleep. There was something weighty in the stillness, the kind of tension that coils in the chest before a storm. In Jim's spare room, surrounded by boxes and memories, Walter dressed with the care of a man preparing for battle. He knotted his tie with hands steadier than he felt. In the reflection of the window, he barely recognized himself. A little more gaunt, eyes more resolved, but beneath it all, the same stubborn dignity that had carried him through decades of loss, love, and work. He picked up the folder of evidence, the last letter from Emily, and the photograph of Martha from their wedding day. Then he left the house in silence, locking the door as if sealing away an old life. Outside, the air was cool, sky painted lavender and gold. Walter drove to the house on Catalina Drive with slow deliberation, each block marking a chapter of his life. At every red light, he replayed what he would say, how he would look Scott in the eye and not blink. His heart ached for what might have been. A different son, a different ending. But regret had no place in him this morning. All that remained was the reckoning. As he parked, he saw Scott's car already in the driveway, Lila's beside it. Rachel Goldberg's sedan waited down the block, her presence promised but not paraded. Walter's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he breathed deep. The house seemed smaller now, not the fortress of his grief, but just another stage for a story that refused to end quietly. He rang the bell, and after a long pause, Scott opened the door. Scott looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes, uncertainty wrapped around every movement. The greeting was mumbled, forced, both men unable to reach for the old scripts of family. Lila appeared behind Scott, arms folded, mouth drawn tight. Walter walked past them, setting his bag on the kitchen table, the air thick with things unsaid. The kitchen was bright with morning sun, but cold at its core. The confrontation began not with shouting, but with simple statements. Documents laid flat, copies of the trust, letters from Rachel, photos and voice memos, a timeline of betrayal. Walter did not raise his voice. He did not tremble. Every accusation was supported by evidence, and every wound spoken aloud was a wound already known to Scott, no matter how hard he tried to deny it. Lila fidgeted, her certainty peeling away as the details stacked higher. When Walter played the recording, their own voices whispering in the kitchen about selling the house, about removing Walter from their lives. Scott's composure finally cracked. The sound of his own words, played back in his father's steady presence, forced him to look at himself in a way no amount of denial could shield. Scott pleaded at first with logic, then with tears, finally with desperation. He begged for forgiveness, for another chance, for time to fix what he'd broken. Walter listened, but he didn't move. The pain in Scott's face twisted something deep inside him. A memory of the boy who once asked for bedtime stories and held Walter's hand at the fair. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man whose choices had burned every bridge between them. Lila tried to speak, her words tumbling out about stress, money, the American dream gone wrong. But Walter heard only the hollow ring of excuses, the same tune that had played in his house for years. It was Rachel who broke the spell, stepping forward with the final documents, her voice cool and unyielding. She laid out the facts. The transfer of the house into trust, the legal barriers now in place, the looming threat of police investigation for elder abuse and attempted fraud. Scott's face changed then, shock replaced by rage, then by something broken, a realization of loss so total that for a moment the room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Walter stood his ground. This was not vengeance, not in the way Scott might have expected. It was the setting right of a story that had been twisted by years of silence and fear. Emily arrived, led by Lila's mother, wide-eyed and uncertain. The moment she saw Walter, she broke into tears, running to hug him with all the force of a child who had feared the worst. Walter knelt, gathering her close, the letter she had written still pressed between his fingers. He promised her, quietly so only she could hear, that things would be different now, that she would never be caught in the crossfire of other people's mistakes. Scott watched, hollowed out by shame, as Walter explained that the house and all that came with it now belonged to Emily's future, not his past. That the trust would pay for her education, her safety, her chance at a life not weighed down by the mistakes of her parents. Scott tried to object, but Rachel shut him down with the measured finality of the law. The reality settled like dust in the corners, inescapable and choking. Walter left the house soon after, Rachel's hand steady on his shoulder as they walked to her car. He paused on the porch, looking back one last time, not for what was lost, but to confirm that the cycle was broken. Inside, Scott and Lila argued in low, desperate voices, the sound echoing against bare walls. Emily waved from the window, brave despite her confusion. Walter waved back, his heart breaking and healing all at once. He returned to Jim's house, his body shaking with relief and sadness, every nerve alive. He sat with Jim in the quiet kitchen, both men silent for a long while. Walter poured 2 cups of coffee, his hands no longer trembling, his voice steady as he spoke of the day, of how endings sometimes look nothing like justice and yet feel just as true. He read Emily's letter again, tracing each word as if memorizing a map of hope. Days passed, and the phone calls stopped. Scott and Lila moved out, their dreams unraveling in the harsh light of consequence. Walter's lawyer called to confirm the trust was safe. The police file closed for now. The neighborhood learned the story in whispers and sidelong glances, some offering sympathy, others only silence. Walter did not care for gossip anymore. He spent his days tending Martha's roses, his nights reading letters from Emily, slowly reclaiming the life that had been stolen piece by piece. One afternoon, as the sun slanted low in gold, Walter received a package at Jim's. Inside, a single photo, Emily, standing in the schoolyard, smiling as if nothing in the world could touch her. On the back, a note in careful, childish print. "I love you, Grandpa. Thank you for keeping your promise." Walter's eyes stung as he set the photo on the table. He understood, finally, that some legacies were written not in money or houses, but in courage, in the quiet refusal to let betrayal define the story's ending. He realized, too, that forgiveness was its own kind of freedom, not a gift for Scott but a release for himself. As night fell, Walter walked the block in the gentle dark, Martha's memory at his side, his heart lighter than it had been in years. There was no victory, not in the sense the world measures such things, but there was peace. He had survived. He had protected what mattered. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Walter Brooks was not afraid of what it might hold. Walter Brooks settled into his new routine quietly, the world outside shifting toward autumn, his inner landscape marked by a different sort of change. He'd moved out of Jim's place, grateful for friendship but needing space for the silence he'd fought so hard to claim. With the house on Catalina Drive safely in trust, he rented a small apartment on the edge of Santa Fe, close enough for Emily to visit, far enough to keep old wounds from reopening at every familiar corner. The rooms were small, sun-washed, filled with the scent of coffee and old books. He unpacked the last of his boxes slowly, the act itself a meditation. Photographs of Martha, letters from Emily, even a faded drawing Scott had made as a child. Some days, nostalgia hurt more than anger ever had. Walter volunteered at the local senior center, fixing leaky faucets and mending broken window latches, sharing slow lunches and quieter stories with others who had their own regrets and scars. It was work that demanded patience and care but offered, in return, a sense of usefulness he hadn't known in years. The others, men and women who had lived full lives and lost much along the way, never asked why he'd left Tucson. Walter liked it that way. He carried the weight of his choices quietly, not as shame, but as proof that he was still capable of choosing. Letters from Emily arrived every few weeks, bright, enthusiastic reports on school projects, new friends, questions about the world and requests for stories about Martha. Walter replied to each one with steady devotion, his handwriting growing stronger with every page. Sometimes, her words were enough to fill his small apartment with hope. Sometimes, they stung, reminders of what Scott had cost them all. The quiet ache of a grandfather loving a child in the space left behind by her parents' failure. Scott and Lila drifted to the margins of Walter's life, their absence less an open wound than a dull ache that would not quite fade. He heard from Jim, from neighbors, that Scott had tried to start over, that he struggled to find steady work, that Lila had taken a job out of state, and that, for a while, Emily had lived with Lila's mother. Walter did not gloat, nor did he pity. He felt a complicated blend of sorrow and relief, a confirmation that justice, even when it came slowly, was not always clean or kind. Sometimes, on nights when the wind was sharp and the past felt close, Walter wondered about forgiveness, not as something to give Scott, but as something to find for himself. He had stood his ground, had defended what mattered, but the cost was written in every line on his face, every quiet moment alone at the dinner table. Yet in those moments of doubt, he would hold Martha's photograph, remember her laughter, and recall her last advice. Don't let what's broken in them break you too. It was enough to keep going, to keep believing that the legacy he left Emily would be something better, cleaner than the story Scott had written for himself. One Saturday, as the first cold snap of winter settled in, Walter was surprised by a knock on his door. He opened it to find Emily, bundled in a too-big coat, her hair tangled from the wind, her face shining with pride. She held out a piece of paper, an essay she'd written for school about the bravest person she knew. Walter read it twice before he trusted himself to speak. In her clear, steady voice, Emily wrote about her grandfather's courage, about kindness as an act of strength, about how real bravery sometimes means standing up for yourself even when it's hard. She did not mention Scott or Lila. She didn't have to. They spent the weekend together, making pancakes, walking the banks of the Rio Grande, telling stories that belonged to both of them now. Emily asked questions about Martha, about Tucson, about the time Walter fixed her bike with a paperclip and determination. For the first time since leaving Catalina Drive, Walter felt the future open a little, a promise instead of a threat. On Sunday afternoon, as Emily left with her grandmother, Walter hugged her tight and whispered a promise to always be there, no matter what roads life took her down. The winter deepened, and with it, a slow sense of healing. Walter continued his work at the senior center, made a few new friends, shared coffee and memories with men who had lost wives and children, and found meaning in small acts of service. Sometimes he would walk the hills outside town, letting the wind strip away old pain and fill his lungs with the sharp, clean air of possibility. Each step was a reminder. He was not defined by what Scott had done, or by the silence that had once choked him. He was defined by what he chose to protect, by the courage to endure, by the stubborn refusal to give up hope. Months passed. Spring returned. Walter received a letter from Lila, careful and formal, asking if he would be willing to see Scott, who had entered counseling, who wanted to apologize in person, to explain what had happened in those terrible months. Walter took his time. He wrote back with honesty. Not cruelty, not anger, but the clear-eyed truth of a man who had spent too long swallowing his own hurt. He agreed to meet, but on his terms, in a cafe crowded enough for privacy. The day of the meeting, Walter dressed in his best shirt, his hands steady, his heart armored by experience. Scott arrived late, looking older, a shadow of the man who had once tried to take everything from his father. He stumbled through apologies, explanations, promises of change. Walter listened, but kept his own words measured and calm. He told Scott that trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt, that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, and that while the law had done its part, real healing had to be earned. Scott wept, tried to take Walter's hand, but Walter let him go. He paid for his coffee, left the cafe, and walked home in the soft spring rain, feeling no anger, no relief, just a clear, aching emptiness that felt, strangely, like freedom. In the weeks that followed, Walter poured himself into new routines. He taught a woodworking class at the senior center, helped organize a fundraiser for children's books, began mentoring a teenager from the neighborhood whose own father had vanished years before. The acts were small, the difference almost invisible, but Walter felt the fabric of his life mending stitch by careful stitch. Emily visited often, her laughter echoing in rooms once heavy with silence. Sometimes she brought friends, sometimes she came alone, but always, she left a note on his kitchen table. "See you soon, Grandpa." On the first anniversary of his move to Santa Fe, Walter threw a small dinner for the friends he'd made, the people who had reminded him that family could be chosen as well as inherited. He stood at the head of the table, Emily by his side, and raised a glass to absent friends, to Martha's memory, and to the quiet, hard-won dignity of surviving. As the evening faded into stories and soft laughter, Walter felt a peace settle over him, fragile but real. In the end, Walter Brooks learned that legacies are measured not by what you leave behind in a will, but by the love you carry forward, by the small, stubborn acts of hope that refuse to be extinguished, even when everything seems lost. His journey had been marked by betrayal and loss, but also by the fierce grace of redemption, the courage to stand alone, and the quiet, unwavering faith that the next chapter could still be written with kindness.